Okay, so we've got a lot to talk about today with both the first eclipse in Pisces occurring on the 17th of September and then the Libra equinox coming up at the end of the week. So there's tons that we can cover, and I will say it's not as dramatic as you might think. So let's dive in. I'm going to show you the charts for both the eclipse and the Libra equinox. We're going to talk a little bit about the chart for the Libra equinox in context of the Aries ingress for 2024 and go through all of this the way that ancient and medieval astrologers would have interpreted it so that you can feel really in line with what you might expect and why this one's volume is not that loud. So let me go ahead and show our screen. And here, of course, we have the Luna program. Now, this is the eclipse. It's set for, typically I would do Washington, D.C., but because I live so close to Washington, D.C., it doesn't change anything. So what we see here is the chart for the lunar eclipse happening on September 17th at 10:34 p.m. Eastern Time. And this will give us the rising sign for Washington, D.C. We use Washington, D.C. because it is the nation's capital for the United States, the nation that I live in, and that I'm focusing on for my predictions for this. So if you are in a different country or a different locality, you can cast the chart for your capital or your focus of rulership in that space, or you can even do it for where you live specifically to say, how is this eclipse going to affect where I am? Far more specifically than just the nation as a whole. But I'm doing this for all of you, and I'm doing it for the place that I live in as an example. So when we look at this eclipse, the first thing we want to do is the same thing we do with every regular lunation. After all, this is a full moon. It's just a really amped up full moon. It's a different kind of full moon, and there's a reason for this. So we've got our full moon, the moon being exactly opposite the sun. The moon is in Pisces, the sun is in Virgo. This is the first time we're experiencing an eclipse in Pisces, and it's going to start a trend over the next 2 years or so of eclipses now occurring on the Virgo-Pisces axis. For the last 2 years or so, they have been occurring on the Aries-Libra axis because they are following the nodes. So you can see now the nodes are getting close to the beginning of the sign because nodes actually always move retrograde. They've always moved backwards. The node is now approaching the 0 Aries degree, and then it will move into Pisces. And because the moon and the sun are within about 13 to 15 degrees of that node, this is an eclipse. But as you'll observe here, they are on the very edge of that period or of that range. So this is a very partial eclipse. And now you know how you can spot an eclipse in a chart. And now you know how you can spot an eclipse in a chart and how to tell how total or partial the eclipse is. How close is it to the node? The closer, the more total. And if it's further, it's more partial. And the other thing we can see is this eclipse visible to the place that we're casting this chart for? So if you're in Washington, D.C., you would ask yourself, am I going to be able to see this eclipse? And the answer is yes. And that is because you can see that the horizon is marked by the ascendant and the descendant. So everything in the top half of that chart is in the sky at the time of this chart's moment. So at 10:34 p.m., we do know that if we would look up to about the middle of the sky, we would see the moon, and close by also Saturn. You can't see Neptune because it's so far away, but the planet is there in the sky. So you also can't see the node because it's not a tangible thing. It's a calculation between the sun and the moon's declination. So when the sun and the moon occur in a lunation, a new moon or a full moon, close enough to these nodes, that's how we know they are at the right level to block each other out, or for the Earth to block out the moon during a lunar eclipse. So what we're seeing here is it's a full moon, but because the sun and the moon are at the right level, the Earth, which we can just imagine is in here, is going to sort of just a little bit block out the moon from getting all of the sun's rays, which would typically be the full moon. So that's what makes this the lunar eclipse. The moon is going to be pretty much directly above you at 10:34 p.m. or so. You can adjust that if you're on the West Coast. That's about 7:34 or 7:34 p.m. or so. But again, this is so mild, it's so partial that you're probably not going to notice a whole lot by looking at the moon. Typically in folk magic, we would say, beware the baleful rays of a lunar eclipse. In this one, I'm really not as concerned because it is going to be such a glancing full lunar eclipse here. So I remember the last lunar eclipse, which was also very partial. I woke up to actually look at it from inside my home. I was going to look at it and just see what it looked like in the sky, because witnessing astrology is just 75% of the fun. And so I looked out and it looked like a full moon. So I was a little disappointed in the spectacle. But again, this plays into our interpretation, where ancient astrologers would say the amount of the moon that is covered by the eclipse will show the proportion of the population affected by it. So when we're looking at a lunar eclipse of the moon, what we're seeing is an effect on the population of a nation. So if a nation is related to that eclipse, whether their chart has synastry with the eclipse, whether clima is assigned to the eclipse, which is something the United States and the Western Hemisphere doesn't have, because when climas were being assigned, they didn't know about us, so we don't have that. The other way that we go by it is, of course, if you can see the eclipse, it can see you. So in this case, we're saying we are possibly affected by this eclipse, and how many of us, or what proportion of the population that the eclipse is affecting are affected. It's a very partial one. It's very slim. It's a small portion. And so now we go into, okay, this is an eclipse in Pisces. What does that mean? In traditional astrology, they would have talked about how the eclipse is affecting still waters in Pisces. So water that's not moving and doesn't have as much of the current. Now, they do include rivers in this. So rivers and small bodies of water, lakes and things like that. If you are looking for the effects of this eclipse, you would look to those forms of water and the creatures that live there, or things surrounding those forms of water. Now, another thing that is involved in this, of course, because it is Pisces, there are some sacred rites that are brought up in the ancient texts, and that can relate to kings. Even though this is a lunar eclipse, Pisces is associated with sacred rites and the population of kings. Thinking about the color purple being royal is one of the ways I associate that. It's a lunar eclipse, so we may not see that particular theme as expressed, or we could. So I'm going to bring it out there so that you know that it's a possibility and we can see what happens. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that eclipses are a transiting event. The moon will be occluded by part of the Earth's shadow during this eclipse on September 17th. However, in ancient astrology, they believed that eclipses had their own initiation. They began a series of events, and they had ways of figuring out when those events would unfold and when they would intensify and when they would settle down. One of the ways is brought on by Ptolemy, who wrote Tetrabiblos. And so Ptolemy says you're going to look at the chart and you're going to see how long this eclipse lasts. That's going to tell you how long its effects will last. And so this is an eclipse that is about 4 hours, and it's 4.3 hours long, I believe NASA said. And so for a lunar eclipse, it's going to be months. For a solar eclipse, it would be years. We'll talk about that with the Libra solar eclipse coming up later. But this is months, because the moon goes around the zodiac in a month. And so we'll cast out 4 months for the amount of time that whatever this eclipse is signifying will take. That's how long the events will unfold for. But that doesn't start on the day of the eclipse necessarily. If this eclipse were happening at the ascendant, it would be a more immediate event. It would be something happening very quickly, right away. But because it's in that top section, it's actually going to happen a couple ways out. So we're going to cast it, assuming that the above portion here is like a year. We're going to say it's going to happen in maybe the second quarter or second third of that year. So we're going to push it out about 4 months and say within 4 to 8 months, we're going to see this eclipse effects starting. From now, that would be between January and I think April. Then the intensification also is based off of this. So within that April or January to April phase, it's going to be in the middle third of that. That's the intensification. So something begins sometime between January or April. And then in that period of 4 months and roughly like 6 days or so, of 4 months, and I think I calculated 3 days. But anyway, in that period of 4 months and 3 days from January onward, or possibly if it begins later from April onward, it's not an exact science on this one, then we will find the intensification roughly in the second third of that period too. So we're going to keep an eye out and see what happens a couple months from now. And I will, of course, keep you apprised in the student study of the Modern School of Ancient Wisdom. We've already had our monthly lesson on this where we got in really deep into the calculations of eclipses and things, and we made a prediction, and now we all get to track it and see how it goes. But for this case, for the transiting eclipse, this is what we see, the moon very close to Pisces. And so if we wanted to use this in a more personal personality sense, I would say this is really focusing on maybe witnessing your dreams, maybe resting. Remember, this is not a time that we practice a lot of folk magic. This is a time where we are witnessing, allowing the eclipse to show us what our resources are. And so in this case, I'm going to say pay attention to your dreams because Neptune is very closely involved. And Neptune is retrograde mutually applying to the moon in Pisces. There's a lot of subconscious kind of stuff going on there with themes resonating on that. So pay attention to your dreams, do some dream journaling, and then just allow yourself to process things. That's part of what your dreams are helping you do. It's helping your mind heal and process through things that we've been through, possibly over the last decade as we're coming into this new eclipse cycle. So be very gentle with yourself. In the Modern School of Ancient Wisdom this week, I gave the students a recipe for some sleep and bedtime tea that will help that process along as well. And that is something that we can focus on with this eclipse. Now, moving into the equinox, and it's very easy to get there with this program, which is one of the things I appreciate most about Luna. Thank you, Kevin, who designs Luna. We're going to go to the solar ingresses here under cycles, and we can pop over here to the autumn equinox. Now, that's, of course, assuming you're in the Northern Hemisphere. It's the Libra equinox for everybody. So now we see this. Now, there's a reason why I'm not going to look at this chart for the condition of the United States for the year. And that's because according to ancient astrologers, if at the Aries ingress, we have a fixed sign, we only need to look at one chart for the whole year because that's going to be the main focus of the year. The year is going to be fixated on one major theme throughout, as compared to some years where it's like every month seems to be something different. This year, for the United States anyway, it was a Scorpio rising year. So it was a fixed sign, which means we only needed to look at the Aries ingress sign for the condition of the whole year. Again, we went over this and actually brought up the different timeline and watched this chart evolve in the student study of the Patreon of the Modern School of Ancient Wisdom. So if you join us there, you'll be able to catch that replay. It's fascinating the way that things have aligned with events already. And we, of course, have made some predictions for things coming up. But for the sake of fun, for the sake of folk magic, for the sake of leaning into the energy that is coming up with this change in the seasons, let's look at the Libra equinox chart and say, how might this show the vibe of fall? So we're going to take ourselves out of traditional astrology a little bit, and we're going to go much more into the folk magic realm, using the astrology to help us lean into the feeling of what we're going to experience with this equinox. And so for this, what we see is, of course, the sun at 0 degrees and 0 minutes of Libra. And that is also the ascending sign. So we've got the sun just having risen maybe about an hour or so before here, because you can see the ascendant down here. So the sun is above it a little bit. And we have Venus still in Libra by a hair, but she's there. So I really like that the sun, even though the sun has entered the sign that is considered its fall, which is kind of coincidental for us in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the sign of its fall because it's opposite its exaltation. So if it's exalted and praised over here, it doesn't get as much praise over here. The sun is about to lose its light. So we're at this equinox where the sun's not going to start gaining light more during the day. It's going to start losing light more during the day. So the sun is considered to be debilitated. That's like the sun's main thing, is to bring light, right? So if it gets less time to do that here in the Northern Hemisphere, then that is part of the reason why we see that seasonal kind of correspondence with fall, because of that declining in light, which is how it was originally defined, because the original astrologers were in the Northern Hemisphere. I have talked to astrologers who are based in countries like Australia, and they say that the significations tend to still work even in the Southern Hemisphere. So I'm going to work with that because the people who know best have assured me. And they say it's more about the themes of fall that we're seeing in that time and less about the actual expression of fall in our locality. So we'll go with that. That's awesome. So let's lean into Libra season here a little bit and look at the fact that the sun is now in Libra, Venus is there. This is good. This is considered chariot for Venus. So Venus is doing really, really, really well to kick off and initiate what would be the birth chart of this next 3 months. So that shows us that the next 3 months with this Libra theme, that's actually front and center. The sun's there, sure, but so is the ascendant. In mundane astrology or world astrology, the ascendant would represent the people, and the sun would be one of the representations of the king or the ruler. So we can see how in Libra, it was always going to be about, where are things balanced? How are things just? Where can we find what is right and really separate what we desire from what we think is not the best option? And we're seeing that this actually seems pretty well supported. The people are focused on it, and so is the leadership. And Venus is also there supporting that as well, lending her domicile lord aid to that with the sun. So it seems like the next 3 months will feel pretty empowered for knowing what your ethics are, for knowing where you stand, for figuring out how to find balance in the world around you and the way you perceive it. Now, another thing we can keep in mind here, if we are going to go into the mundane astrology thing, is that Mars is up in Cancer in the sign of his fall, because he's exalted in Capricorn, and he is in that midheaven. So there's a lot of, let's put the keyword of argument going on around key factors, probably around community, around society. This is what we're going to see in the headlines potentially. And so there is still a battle going on in leadership. And in the United States, of course, we can see that expressed, right? There is an election year happening. So you can see how one thing and the other fit really well with the keywords from ancient times. And then we also see where else are the people focused. The people are also the moon. So the moon is in Gemini with Jupiter at this moment, trining the sun. Jupiter is trining the ascendant. These are good things to me. Jupiter is conjunct the lot of fortune. Even though Jupiter is in the sign of detriment, we still see this happening in the 9th house. That's where politics fall. It's where religion falls. It's where your greater thinking or broader thinking happens. Foreign travel also happens here. So thinking about the things that help really define what you believe, why you believe it, and where you put those things in life can fall into that 9th house. Astrology also does too. So we're really focused on, not a surprise, you guys, finding balance, understanding what our values are, really defining what values we want to support and who's going to help us do that. The people, the king is in the place of the people, and there's still a battle going on for the position, for the seat of that king, and the people and the I would say even the judges, which are represented by Jupiter, are all still focused on that 9th house topic of politics, potentially. There's a lot of talking going on with that. There's a lot of messaging happening here. There's a lot of thinking and cerebral qualities because that is Gemini. So these are some things that I'm bringing into our interpretation, but also knowing in context, this is really just emphasizing what the Aries ingress already told us about the year being focused on these themes already. I do have an Aries ingress video where I went over this whole thing. It is totally free. You can go to the link that will hopefully be in the description below, and you'll be able to get the link to the video so that you'll be able to see that Aries ingress and see what that tells us about still the next half of the year. We have 6 more months before the 2025 Aries ingress, and we have reached this halfway point. So by folk magic, this is this turning point. This is this midpoint of the year. It's looking back at how far you've come. Things you can do to honor this equinox with folk magic are very midpoint type things, which would be because we are halfway through this zodiacal year, looking back and seeing how far you've come. How are your goals doing? Do you need to adjust them? Have you achieved some of them and now you can move on to something next? Where do you feel like you stand? What are you ready to let go of and move forward with? Where are you ready to slow down a little bit? Think about the seasons and how they are changing around you. How can you mirror them and flow with them? If you are in the Northern Hemisphere and things are getting a little bit colder and you're kind of going inward a little bit, are your foods now going to be warmer? Are you going to be dressing a little bit warmer? Not like me today. I'm living in the South. It's still hot. But what are you going to do that is going to help you move and flow with the energy that you are experiencing around you? Teas are a really amazing thing to do right now. figuring out what seasonal ingredients are available to you as far as produce and everything goes, so that you can plan how you are going to allow your body to adjust to these changes just as much as nature is. So I hope that this has been a really helpful video. There's been a lot to it. It's a big week, but it is also a week to be gentle with yourself. And I hope that you take the time to do that. And I hope that you experience that healing, that processing, and all of the beauty that comes along with aligning yourself with your nature, with the nature around you, and with your own desires. Have a great week. I will see you again soon.